for a period of that very narrow band of that solstice, we will get a period of 4 or 5 days in which the magnetic squeeze might be such that the magnetism of the sun is absolutely collapsed down. And then it's anybody's guess, because we're magnetically and electrically tied to the sun. All the planets are. So what happens there and what happens to us could indeed be quite catastrophic. But there's nothing within that particular set of prophecy from which all these others are picked out that says everybody's going to be destroyed and so on. Now, there are other prophetic Mayan traditions that relate to this particular time in terms of the end of the world, but they mean it in terms of an end of an age, and each age was destroyed previously by a different set of circumstances. And in this particular case, that particular Maya prophecy tradition says that this particular world, our civilization will just be destroyed by the combination of drought, massive infertility, which means crop failure, also the inability to produce livestock and humans, as well as earthquakes and volcanism simply because of the heating up of the internal part of the planet. That's also replicated in other data coming from places like the Narmer Plate and from some of the stuff that was revealed by a couple of Tibetan monasteries. They've been holding this particular data set that goes back 18,000, 19,000 years in language that predates Sanskrit. These all coalesce to essentially provide us with another view of, and if you will, a framework to envision what's going on right now. Because as we know, things just aren't normal here. And they haven't been normal on the planet for some time. That includes, actually, the solar radiation.
What is the Narmer Plate? I've never heard of that.
The people that pre-existed Pharaohic Egypt called their land Narma, N-A-R-M-A, or N-A-R-M-E-R, depending on who's doing the translation. And there's this particular plate that was created by these individuals in a vitrified stoneware that we cannot reproduce, that we don't know how it was done. And it has weird magnetic properties, and it actually was what attracted everybody to the plate to begin with. But the Narmer Plate, which I don't know if you can find references on the internet or not, I've never looked for it that way. I have a documentary reference to it from the 1960s in a book. But it shows in a hieroglyphic form results of the previous 12 instances, if you will, of us passing through this magnetic band. So it basically is talking about 12 cycles, each about 18,700 years or more, because it's a little bit irregular. As you might imagine, as we go through the magnetism, our whole solar system slows down a bit in terms of its transit. And then we pop out. Sometimes we go faster, and sometimes we go slower. Now, the Narmer Plate's very interesting because it points out, as I say, the previous, actually it points out and describes the previous 11 times. And some of them were horrific. Some of them included, flood, continents disappearing, and one of them, it describes a situation in which it says basically 25 million people used to exist in this area, and now the whole continent's gone. And they just sunk below the seas. So, but then it also talks about times where basically it's saying, we dodged a bullet then. It wasn't that bad. And then it points out that, y'all are facing it here about the first quarter, if you will, the first 3 or 4 months of 2013.
Boy, and just as all of this, as you're discussing all of this, I get an emergency weather alert for my area. Unseasonably high temperatures.
2 days ago, we had 8 inches of snow here. We still have passes that aren't open.
Oh my God! You're here on the West Coast too.
Yeah.
This happened last month, where suddenly, we had this wonderful. I'm in California on the Monterey Bay, and we had just idyllic days. It was like spring used to be. Then I got this emergency weather alert, and if people are not signed up for these, you need to be. And I had just gone out and bought seedlings from my local organic gardener, and I had all my seedlings planted, and it says it's going to drop below freezing. So I had to go out and cover all my seedlings, or they would have been dead. The next day, it went up to over 100 degrees here.
Right. We now have to deal with those kind of extremes, what we call the oscillation. But this is not unexpected. What's really curious, of course, is you were citing earlier about all the people who are saying that, our DNA is going to change and so on and so on. And there's some evidence to support some of these kinds of theories, because we are in a period where vast quantities of species are going extinct, but also we're getting all kinds of reports of mutation, Montauk monsters and this kind of thing. But it's an issue of oscillation, and this was known back into the 50s. And Isaac Asimov wrote about it. He said, boy, if we're lucky, we'll go into an ice age. Otherwise, we go into a Venus state, and none of us survive.
Well, let's talk about oscillation, Venus state, and Isaac Asimov. When we get back, we are talking with Clif from Half Past Human, and you're listening to Rumor Mill News on the Micro Effect Radio Network. We'll be back.
And I'll try anything to keep it working.
You're listening to Rumor Mill News Radio. My name is Brandon, and I am talking with Clif from Half Past Human, and we were talking about oscillation and Isaac Asimov and the heating up and the cooling down and the back and the forth, and how do we grow crops in all of this?
That's a real good question. We're facing an issue that relates, if anyone really wants to get a good view of it, they can go and look at the Maurice Cottrell videos on YouTube, and he discusses how the sun is intimately involved with fertility of all different kinds for all species here on our planet. We also note that various species seem to go extinct at various points, and these points all kind of coincide with our drift up and down through the magnetic ecliptic of the Milky Way galaxy. It's my opinion, which is shared by a number of individuals, that our solar system used to be part of Sagittarius B and is being sucked into the Milky Way, and at some point will become subsumed and will no longer transit the ecliptic and will just become part of the Milky Way galaxy. But at our current state, we keep going through it. So our fertility issues are going to relate to light levels, affecting everything from the human pineal gland all the way down through to how plants react, as well as the climatic aspects of both internal and external heating sources. Bear in mind that the planet's heating from the inside as well as getting heat from the outside, and now we have an excess of both. So my particular approach is to cover everything, to assume that I'm going to be in a period where one day I'll have heat, the next day I'll have cold. So I'm going to do everything outside my grow dome in cold frames. So all my cold crops can be covered for protection, because you can actually have lettuce growing relatively well, albeit slowly, in the midst of snowstorms. Now, I'm pretty sure this could really confuse the plants, so I'm somewhat concerned about pollination. But even so, on a biointensive level, you can walk around with a little paintbrush, for instance, and pollinate all of your tomatoes and cross-pollinate your squash and so on. And it is doable, but it's going to be very difficult. And we're going to have, at the monocropping giant hive level of agriculture that we have, we're going to have a huge collapse in productivity. I'm talking maybe 60 to 70% is what's indicated by our data over the next 2 years.
You mean the big mega farms that are owned by the giant corporations?
Correct.
Okay.
And we'll also start seeing some indications of it this year when you'll start to see reports out of the large livestock breeding industries of inability to deliver, for instance, fertilized cells because artificial insemination isn't taken, or because we're getting a lot of mutations in the hyperactive breeding programs that they have for, chickens, pigs, etc., which is going to cause all kinds of consternation in the food supply, etc. Even now we're finding that WHO and the FDA are admitting they can't control the food supply and keep it safe. Again, my caution to everybody is, every single mouthful of food that you can produce locally is one less demand on the planet as a whole. Kind of a very personal level of live simply that others may simply live.
Exactly. I've been urging people to move to the country and live simply for almost 13 years now. I mean, those of us who, I don't know, maybe we're psychic or something, but we saw this coming.
Well, sure, yeah, and in fact, everyone's psychic. I mean, it's kind of a misnomer to think of humans as not being psychic, and that's an point of active denial. I think it's merely a matter of range. You're either really sensitive to it or, some degree not so sensitive to it. But that also brings up another issue. I don't know that I would advise people to relocate. Turns out that a biointensive source of food can be in as little, for an individual on a vegan diet, can be in as little space as 1,100 square feet. Many places in urban environments find that. There's also some suggestion, at least within some of the literature going on, especially if we go all the way back to what happened to Cuba and they're having to grow all their own food when the Soviets no longer shoved money down their throats, that urban environments can be extremely productive, especially on multi-tier buildings. So you can do all kinds of things in cities, and there's huge movements in New York now for growing whole neighborhoods worth of food in both abandoned buildings and abandoned lots.
Now, how if our energy grid is shut down, how can we grow food inside an abandoned building if there's no sun?
Well, there's all kinds of crops that are relatively effective at low light levels. And there's synergistic effects, such as on a lot of buildings you can have greenhouses on the top. And say you were growing endive, for instance. Well, it requires a cold, dark environment for a while, so it's sheltered. You can grow mushrooms.
What was the name of that thing we were growing? I didn't hear it.
Endive. It's a form of highly nutritious lettuce.
Lettuce, okay.
That you see in Europe. You don't really see it around here so much. It was just an example. But the energy grid is going down. It's under tremendous strain. We haven't done in our country. We haven't done any serious infrastructure work since the early 70s. And I don't know how long we expect it to last under these conditions, but it can't go on much longer. There's also the real possibility that the government and the powers that be are preparing for that we'll have a catastrophic level of solar flares, destroying satellites, etc. There's even something.
I was just going to talk about that. That's on my list of questions.
Yeah, and so they are actively preparing for that. And their assumption is that, that these solar flares might actually be so severe, and it relates back to the magnetism. If the sun is clamped, so to speak, in a giant magnetic grip, if you had the sun in your giant magnetic hand and you held it and squeezed it for a while, as you release it, the energy that is in there has built up and it wants to go somewhere. So their supposition is that no matter what, Earth is going to probably take a hit sometime around the passing of the midpoint through to about 2017.
Yeah, I have been told about that. And that knocks out all of our computers, our cell phones.
Or it's even worse than that, because if it takes out cell phone towers, by the way, then you can be assured it'll take out almost every transformer in that area. And we no longer have the ability to produce these transformers. I'm talking about the big box that sits out on the pole that actually provides the conversion from DC electricity to AC electricity for your particular last 100 feet of connection to your house. Once those transformers go, we're gone.
That might be the best thing that ever happened to us, though. You know, when you think about all of these energy grids and digital television and
the electromagnetic pollution, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly.
Well, universe and consciousness is pretty much perfect in and of itself, and it's just a great game for us to play in. So I'm assuming that whatever does happen will be just as universe wants it to be. And the only issue is our attitude about it.
Do you think we're going back to the 50s, or are we going back to the 1800s?
No, I don't know that that's the case at all. We actually have countervailing trends in what we call, in this particular entity in our data, that we call space scope farts. Now, that term was chosen deliberately because what we wanted was to have an area, a bucket, if you will, where we could dump in everything that was unknown to us, everything that was officially denied, and everything that we had evidence for that was ignored, so that we could have an area for all the stuff we don't know. Well, there's some interesting stuff coming out of there, suggesting that while we're having this downward spiral, if you will, there's a countervailing trend of an upward spiral and whole new technologies that will be emerging over the next few years. So I don't know that it's true that we'll be going back to the 1950s. It may be that a significant portion of the human civilization fails due to the infertility that struck the Mayans and all these others, again at these same kind of junction points